Great regular season, lackluster postseason. What can we expect this year from the Wild's top D pairing in Jared Spurgeon and Jake Middleton? Plus, where did they rank numbers wise amongst pairings that had a ton of minutes? We discussed today on Locked on Wild.
You're Locked on Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is up? What's happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked on Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you, as always, for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. If you have not already, make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any of our new episodes as we move through the rest of the off season. On today's episode of Locked on Wild, we lay out the season expectations for Jared Spurgeon and Jake Middleton. We'll look at their statistics amongst some of the other D pairings that logged a ton of minutes together this past season. We'll look at how that didn't translate in the postseason and what we can expect from both Spurgeon and Middleton this season as well. My name is Seth Topal, your daily Minnesota Wild insider, and glad to have you back here for a Tuesday edition of Locked on Wild. And with time winding down before we get to the start of training camp and the preseason, we're consolidating Locked on Wild boot camp a little bit, and we're going to focus specifically on D pairings together. We've got the goalies to get to as well as the coaching staff. So we want to make sure we get everything in before the games start to hit. And so today we'll start with the top pairing for the Minnesota Wild, that being Jared Spurgeon and Jake Middleton. And I want to hit you with the stat right off the bat. This is courtesy of moneypuck.com. And if you look throughout the entirety of the NHL, D pairings that played at least 1,000 minutes together, there were 8 of them in the NHL, in the entirety of the NHL this past season. And the Minnesota Wild had the top D pairing in terms of goals against per 60 minutes, that being Jake Middleton and Jared Spurgeon. They allowed just 28 goals in 76 games. That's a 1.65 goals per 60 minutes against. Scored 28 goals themselves while out there on the ice. But that was best amongst any of the D pairings that played at least 1,000 minutes together. The Carolina Hurricanes had the second best in Slavin and Burns in terms of goals against per 60 minutes. And so an effective combo for the Minnesota Wild. And Jared Spurgeon had a good regular season once again, but we saw what we have seen over the last couple of seasons in the postseason where he kind of gets pushed around. Having Jake Middleton as his pairing partner has helped because Middleton obviously has a little more size and can try to combat some of that. But we have seen this become a problem throughout the postseason over the last few years. Is you're going up against bigger players, and Spurgeon just is not able to translate that defensive success during the regular season into the postseason. That goals against per 60 minutes for Middleton and Spurgeon at 1.65 in the regular season, it balloons to 3.92 in the postseason this past year. And so just not able to carry that success into the regular season. But this is the go-to pairing for the Minnesota Wild on defense. This is the one that Dean Evison uses in a ton of different situations. You obviously have Middleton, who brings the physicality, but also is very, very good on defense himself. And Jared Spurgeon has shown time and time again throughout the course of his career that he has the ability to make plays that a lot of defensemen just cannot do. And once these two were united on that top pairing, the Wild defense started to really slot in and follow suit. And by and large, it was just a solid season for those two guys, as evident by the numbers that they put up on a pairing together. Now, they bring contrasting styles. Middleton is certainly not um, an offensive defenseman. He definitely is a defensive defenseman. And so you're not going to get a ton in the way of goals and points from him. We've seen Jared Spurgeon over the past couple of seasons. We've seen his goal totals be near double digits or at double digits. In fact, 4 out of the last 5 seasons, he has hit double digits in goals. So he certainly is capable of stepping up in the play and providing some help offensively, something that the Wild were not able to do as much this past season as they were 2 years ago. 2 years ago, they had a ton of points from the defense position because they handled the puck so much that defensemen were able to push up in the play and help out offensively. This past season, that was not the case. And so maybe there's a hope that the Wilds can go back to that with a little bit more consistent offense and an offense that is more able to control the puck, push the action up the ice, that maybe you see some of Spurgeon's numbers climb back up here over the course of this season. So it's the top pairing for the Wild, and as a result, they draw a lot of attention. They draw some tough assignments too. Now, that's not to say that Jonas Brodin and Brock Faber are just unplayable, because they obviously are not. But this is the pairing that Dean Evison trusts the most. And so they are the ones that draw that top billing a lot of the time. And regular season, it worked great. Postseason, it did not. So going to be very interesting to see if that happens again, or if we start to see some changes to where, they can find a way to not get bullied around, as has happened the last couple of seasons. So we'll talk a little bit more about the expectations and some of the things to watch. But when we come back, we're going to take a look at the statistics for both Jared Spurgeon and Jake Middleton. We'll see where they slotted in last year and what we can expect this season from both Middleton and Spurgeon. That is on the way as we continue today's episode of Locked on Wild after this. The NFL season is underway, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to win all season long, because right now when you bet on a Super Bowl winner, you can get bonus bets every time they win in the regular season. Unfortunately, if you put money on the Minnesota Vikings, you did not reap those benefits here in week 1. But don't worry, the season is young, and there are plenty more opportunities to throw on the Vikings in hopes that they win a ton of games. And if they do win a ton of games, you'll get bonus bets for every victory. You can use those bonus bets on spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. Justin Jefferson is going to be a very attractive target in the over 100 yards category every game this season. So make sure you don't miss out, because he is probably going to cash that more often than he doesn't. Make sure you visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and start earning bonus bets with America's #1 sportsbook. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Again, FanDuel.com/lockedon. Continuing today's episode of Locked on Wild, once again, thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. For the everydayers, we will be starting our Central Division crossovers tomorrow, as we'll talk with Nick Morgan of Locked on Predators, getting a sense of where Nashville is at heading into the season. We're going to try to run through these with the entire Central Division before the season gets going, so stay tuned for that. Time running out before the regular season hits. Exactly 1 month from today, the Minnesota Wild will be playing at home against the Florida Panthers. We are officially in the 1-month warning before the start of the regular season. So stick with us. We'll get you set every step of the way for what hopefully will be another exciting season for the Minnesota Wild. So from a statistics standpoint, let's look at where both Jared Spurgeon and Jake Middleton ended this past season. Spurgeon played in 79 games, which was the most he's played in a season since 2018-2019. He finished with 11 goals, 23 assists, 34 total points, was a plus 32 on the season, which as things started off, didn't look like that was going to be an attainable number. And Spurgeon did some good work in just being on the ice for a lot of goals. And it led to his plus minus being just one off of his career high set back in 2016-2017. Did finish with 14 penalty minutes, which was the most he's had since 2019-2020, but 14 penalty minutes in 79 games is not a ton. Spurgeon had 1 power play goal and 3 power play assists. So with the fact that Kalen Addison played a lot of power play time, we saw Alex Goligoski get power play time. And then when John Klingberg was acquired by the Minnesota Wild, that's the spot that he stuck until the Wild were eliminated in the postseason. So not a lot in the way of power play time for Spurgeon here over the course of this season, but he did still net a power play goal. 21 minutes, 49 seconds of ice time, which was the most that he's had since 2020-2021. 179 blocks was a career high, shattering his previous career high of 157 back in 2015-2016. Also had 66 hits, 15 takeaways, 20 giveaways, and finished 13th in All-Star voting, 11th in Lady Byng voting, and 13th in Norris Trophy voting this past season. So again, statistically in the regular season, Spurgeon had a fine year. Postseason, those numbers just did not translate to that same level of success. Spurgeon had 2 points in 6 games. He was a -6 in that series, 4 penalty minutes, and it seemed like he was on the ice for every goal that the Dallas Stars scored in that series. Now, Jake Middleton, his numbers looked like this. Middleton in 79 games had 3 goals, 12 assists. The 12 assists were a career high. The 15 points were a career high. The plus 15 was a career high. 72 penalty minutes on the season for Middleton. He did not log any points on the power play because he might have played once or twice on the power play, but really did not hardly at all. So you wouldn't expect there to be any power play points there. But did have 1 shorthanded assist and shot 3.8% on 79 shots. Played 19 minutes, 2 seconds of ice time on average per game. 155 blocks was a career high. 115 hits was 3 off of his personal best set 2 years ago when he was acquired by the Minnesota Wild at the trade deadline. So had 118 hits that season, 18 takeaways, 23 giveaways for Middleton, who again, not going to light it up on the stat sheet, but is just going to give you a lot in the way of blocks and hits and physical defensive play, and a good job just being a responsible defenseman for this team. And the fact that he was traded for Capo Kakinen, it's not going to, I don't think, ever top the Philip Gustafson trade, but this has to be up near the top of the list in terms of Bill Guerin trades that have certainly worked out. And couple it with the fact that you trade Kakinen, who you are hoping is kind of your young goalie of the future, and then you sign Cam Talbot to be kind of a bridge goalie. You trade him for what ends up being a young goalie of at least the near future. in Philip Gustafson. It could not have worked out any better for Bill Guerin with that trade. Now, from a statistics standpoint, let's just look at where things are looking for both Middleton and Spurgeon for this upcoming season. We're going to look at projections courtesy of the fantasy hockey realm of ESPN, just using this as kind of a barometer to gauge where we think various players will slot in. Jake Middleton expected to play 64 games this season. The guy is pretty durable, and just even though he plays physically, he doesn't really show any signs of getting dinged up. So I think he's going to smash the over on 64 games played, 2 goals, 9 assists, 11 total points on the season for Middleton. And honestly, it's not about the points for him. So if he finishes with 10 to 15 points, 2 or 3 goals, that's fine. I wouldn't be surprised if he slots in slightly less in terms of goals and points than he did this past season, because the offense needed to come from elsewhere. He's not going to be somebody that is high up on the list in shooting the puck, in the priority of who should shoot while out on the ice. And so I'm going to say probably the under on those numbers, but the ones that matter are the defensive metrics too. And he should be, right around 150 blocks again, somewhere between 110, 120 hits. And so if he hits those numbers, then things are working just fine for Jake Middleton. Now, let's look at Jared Spurgeon's projections for this season. Pegged by ESPN to play in 75 games, 10 goals, 24 assists, a plus 30 on the season. Honestly, I could see, hear me out on this. I could see another double-digit goal campaign for Jared Spurgeon, because I just am not of the belief that this Wild offense is going to be as bad as it was last season at possessing the puck, which I think is going to lead to less pressure being put on the Wild defense to kind of be playing, kind of hedging their bets, even with the Wild in the offensive zone, and having kind of essentially 1 foot out the door to try to go back to cover if there ends up being an odd man rush or things along that line. I don't think that that's going to be as big of a problem this year, which means that your defensemen are going to be able to be more involved in the play, and having a pairing partner in Jake Middleton, who is way more of the defense-oriented player, allows Jared Spurgeon to weave more in to the offense. So it's not going to surprise me at all if we see another double-digit goal season from Jared Spurgeon. He's been that pretty consistently over the last few years. And so if you get somebody who is a 10 to 12 goal scorer and is somewhere around 25 to 35 points, that seems like a pretty standard area for him to end up from a points perspective. The big numbers to watch for this D pairing are going to be the goals against and the amount of time that they log as line pairing partners throughout the course of the season. If they can hit 1,000 again this year, that's going to be a pretty solid accomplishment for Spurgeon and Middleton. The big issue, as you look at it too, as I mentioned, Spurgeon getting into 79 games this year, that being the most he's had since 2018, 2019. Being 33 now, you worry about the age. You worry about some of the injuries that have caught Spurgeon here and there. Has played a full season, a full 82 game season once, and so there is some worry there. But as long as this pairing is healthy, they should again be a top contributor for this team on the defensive side of the puck. Now, what does being the top pairing for a team entail? And what do we think of the value brought in by both Jared Spurgeon and Jake Middleton on their contracts? We'll discuss that to finish today's episode of Locked on Wild after this. Final segment of today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. For the everydayers, once again, you can join us tomorrow as Nick Morgan of Locked on Predators stops by for a crossover edition of the Central Division collision between the Wild and the Predators, gearing us up for the start of the season with some burning questions for both sides. Make sure you tune in tomorrow for that as we continue to get you set for the start of the season. Expectations for the top D pairing for the Wilds. Well, shut everybody down. That's a big one. Honestly, for me, the thing that I'm going to be keeping an eye on over the next couple of seasons is the Jared Spurgeon contract, because in the Athletics contract evaluation that we talked about with Matt Boldy being such a steal right now for this team, generating a ton of additional value, surplus value for what he is currently signed at. We looked through and discussed, and Jared Spurgeon was playing his contract essentially even. So he was playing as a $7-ish million player, but wasn't bringing a ton of additional value above that. So if he's playing as a defenseman that's basically giving equal output to what he's being paid, that's fine, especially at this part of his career, that post 30 portion of his playing career. That's fine, because $7 million defenseman playing that type of hockey, you're going to get some pretty good things. My concern is what happens when the value put out starts to drop below the levels of that contract. And it may not be something that we see for 1 or 2 or 3 years. It may not be something that we see really at all. But there is potential that we end up seeing, okay, this year he played more like a $5 million a year defenseman. The next year he played more like a $3 million a year defenseman. It's if we start to see those big substantial drops in production that lead to some panic as to, is this going to be a contract that the Wild are looking at and saying, yikes, we got to find a way to make this work over the last few years of the deal. Because as we move through the next 2 seasons, we've talked at length about the players that are locked into this roster. There aren't a ton, but it's guys like Joel Eriksson-Ek, Freddie Gaudreau, Kirill Kaprizov, Matt Boldy, and then Jonas Brodin and Jared Spurgeon. They're not going to be around forever. And so as long as they are producing at a level that meets what they are being paid, there's not going to be an issue. But if the production starts to drop, or if we continue to see the issues that have plagued, in particular, Spurgeon in the postseason, with just being pushed up and down the ice by bigger and more physical players, that's where the problems hop in. Now, for Jake Middleton, his assignments are pretty clear, is to be physical out there, is to be kind of that defensive force that drives the top of this Wild defense. It's not like you're expecting him or requiring that he gets you somewhere around 8 to 10 goals. You're taking all of the offense as a bonus and are just hoping that he runs around and hits people at full speed and just makes life miserable for players, especially along the boards, which is why this pairing works, I think, is you have Spurgeon, who is more than capable of playing good defense and jumping up in the play when necessary. Although some of those offensive skills, that's another thing to keep an eye on, is how some of those offensive skills start to translate here over the next couple of seasons. But you've got Middleton, who is very sound defensively and is capable of staying back and covering ground where Spurgeon can kind of push the play forward. I think that's why that's an effective combo for the Wild here and has been for the last couple of seasons. And they're going to need it to be again this season because while we don't potentially see any regression from a goalie standpoint on the Philip Gustafson side just because of how sound he is. I know we talked about worst case scenarios in yesterday's show, and goaltending being one of them, having some regression. But Philip Gustafson's calm style leads to believe that there isn't going to be a huge drop in his numbers, or maybe any drop. But having a pairing like this in front is going to help, especially, with Marc-Andre Fleury out there, that contrasting style of goalie play, and just going up against the number of top level players that frequent the Western Conference and the Central Division as well. Having that pairing up top that can try to neutralize those guys. Having, in the case of playing the Edmonton Oilers, having the ability to match up with both Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl and feel like you like your odds of slowing those guys down. That is key. And that's key for this team who has relied heavily on their defense and their goaltending to bail out an offense that dropped 60 goals last year from 2 years ago to last year. So if that offense struggles again, there will be reliance on the defense and the goaltending to win this team games. And so if Spurgeon and Middleton are on their game this year, as they have been, if they stay healthy, if they stay productive, if they stay together, they will be a force to be reckoned with for this Minnesota Wild team throughout the course of the season. That will do it for today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, if you have not already, make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any of our new content throughout the course of the week leading up to the start of the season in a couple of short weeks. Make sure you follow us on social media as well. You can find new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.